Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a fun one. It's going to piggyback onto a video I did not too long ago called 5 Things I Wish I Knew When I Started Fishing. These are things that I'm sharing with you that may have taken me years to figure out. Some of them I may not even have figured out on my own. Another angler may have filled me in. And these are things that had I known right off the bat, it would have accelerated my learning curve and taken me from a beginner level to a much more experienced fisherman. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm trying to share these with you so that you don't have to have the same growing pains that I had. I truly believe that in this sport, the more fish catches that you have, the more you're going to fall in love with the sport, which means more people are going to get involved. And I truly do feel like this is something that uh, all of us share as a bond. So the more I can help you catch fish and take away those learning curves, the more you're going to enjoy the sport. So let's get right into this. The first video I did was so well received that I got asked by a lot of you to do more of these. So here we are. We're going to do more of these. I have so many little solid points and tips that I wish I could share with you, but we're going to break it down into a bunch of little videos like this one. The first thing I want to talk about has to do with fishing big flats. Most lakes out there, whether they're natural lakes or they're reservoirs or river systems, have big flats. And these flats are going to be one of the primary areas that fish use to feed. Now, when I was a younger angler, I would locate a big flat, get up on that flat, and just start fan casting around. I'd catch one here, catch one there throughout the course of the day. Maybe I'd catch a handful of fish and be happy with that. What I've since realized is that's not the way to go about fishing these big flats. The big flats may be excellent places for the fish to feed, but you're really going to become a better angler and much more productive angler if you fish the edges of that flat. And what I mean by the edges, you could have a deep break line at the front end of that edge of the flat. You may have a ditch or something that runs through the flat. You may have just your basic shorelines through the flat. You're generally going to be better off though fishing the edges of the flat versus on top of the flat. And the reason for that is the edges are going to congregate more of those fish. That's going to be the holding area that the fish are either using to ambush prey or they're just waiting for their next feeding cycle to move further up on the flat. The point that I'm getting here is you're better off when you're talking about some very large, expansive flats to fish the edges of it to increase the number of bites that you get versus just getting up on the flat and fan casting. Fan casting can work great, but there's times when you literally don't catch fish because your casts were off, meaning you're randomly casting here, randomly casting there, and you're just not coming in contact with the fish. And the same can go the other way. There are some days you make the right fan cast and therefore you come in contact with more fish, but it's really hard to replicate that. It's much easier to replicate it if you're fishing those edges that run throughout the flat, your ditches that come out of them, your break lines, your high percentage areas. So that's definitely one piece of advice that I wish I knew when I was younger. A second kind of plays off of that. Generally speaking, in my opinion, you will be a much more efficient and productive angler to avoid those large flats altogether. The reason for that is you're talking about very large, expansive areas that can take a lot to break down. So, say, as an example, I remember the first time I went to Table Rock Lake, I was like 8 or 9 years old. We stayed at a resort on Indian Creek. We took a little rowboat out and it was just like we got into a flooded forest. There were that many pieces of standing timber around. The lake is since most of those trees are gone now. But the point is, I was overwhelmed by the trees. But when my dad and I got out there, we thought we had found the honey hole because there were so many trees. How could there not be any fish? Well, in reality, the problem was there were too many trees, right? It's the same can be said for a giant pad field, a giant weed flat, a giant rock flat. Absolutely, there's fish that are using it and they're spread out all over the place, but you're going to be better off trying to find the isolated rock patches, your isolated pad fields, your isolated weed flats, your two pieces of standing timber versus 200 pieces of standing timber. the fish generally congregate down to those isolated pieces of cover. So I'm not saying you got to avoid the big flats to find these isolated pieces of structure. I'm just saying that the isolated pieces of structure will almost always be more of a high percentage place than just, fishing a giant flat. Now, having said that, there's always going to be isolated pieces of structure on giant flats as well. And if you can find those are going to be great places to fish, but they take a lot of effort to do that. So it's a lot easier to break down your isolated pieces of cover. So, if you're on a lake that's got giant pad fields, you're probably better off looking for your isolated small pad clumps. Those are going to be better. Same thing with a giant rock flat. You have a giant rock flat, I'm sure there's fish that are roaming over the top of it, but if you find one the size of your boat that's on the middle of a sand flat, that isolated rock patch the size of your boat will almost always be a better high percentage place to fish. So don't think bigger is better or more cover is better, because that will actually spread the fish out more. Your isolated pieces of cover are going to be better. So again, when I was younger, I looked for the most obvious giant flats of whatever I could find in the expanses of the most cover I could find. In reality, I probably would have been better off not going to a cove that had 50 docks in it, but the one that had one dock in it. It would have been an easier target for me to use. A third tip comes down to fishing line. Okay, guys? Fishing line. I wish somebody had told me when I started fishing that fishing line goes on a baitcaster and a spinning reel differently. Meaning, if you put a bait cast, if you just took your spool of line, you ran a pencil through it, and you put it on this way, meaning you were holding your spool just, we'll say, parallel to the floor, that will lead to line twist on your spinning reel. On spinning reel, your spool should be flat on the ground. And what you do is you start putting your line on so that it goes on your reel in the same manner it comes off the spool. I mean, literally, and all spools are kind of different when it comes to this. Some spools like to be labeled up, some spools like to be labeled down. It's up to you guys to figure out how the manufacturer put it on when it comes to a spinning reel. But it's real easy. You just put it on your line. You put it on the way you think it goes on your reel. You crank the handle 5 times. If you take some slack and you get line twist already, switch the spool to the other side, finish putting on your line, you won't have line twist. Nobody ever told me that. I always put it on the same way I put it on a baitcaster. I ran a pencil through it, I had somebody hold it for me, and I just put it on that way. Now, the same can be said for a baitcaster. A baitcaster, you've got line that comes off the bottom of the spool if it's in one direction, or if you flip it over, line that comes off the top. Generally speaking, you want the line to come off the top onto your baitcaster so that it goes on the same way that it goes on the reel. It just comes down to preventing line twist. And nobody ever told that to me when I was putting line on. And it took me years to realize that. And it wasn't something I figured out necessarily on my own through trial and error. It was something I think I read in Bassmaster magazine or in Fisherman, something along those lines. But it took me a long time to recognize that. And line twist, as we know, is one of those things that can destroy your day. Like, it can lead to major headaches and just lead to somebody really not enjoying fishing. So putting the line on your reels is very important. It sounds so simple, but it's something that often goes very misunderstood. All right, so the next up has to do with fishing deep. When for some reason, I don't know why, but my assumption when I was younger, and this was really up until I started fishing professionally, was if you were fishing deep, meaning offshore, you had to be fishing the bottom. And what I think most of us have come to realize, especially now with forward-facing sonar, is there are way more suspended fish out there than we ever really thought. In fact, a lot of them are suspended over very deep water, but they're only, 4 to 15 feet under the surface. So they may be over 100 feet of water, but they're generally going to be somewhat under the surface. And what that means is you don't have to fish the bottom if you're offshore, but more importantly, you don't have to fish deep baits. You can still throw a lot of your shallow running baits, meaning uh, top waters, spinner baits, swim baits, and run them relatively close to the surface. It's one of those things that for me, one of the biggest eye-opening things for me was when I came about on a school of baitfish that were schooling out in the middle of the lake. So I knew I was over 100 feet of water. There were fish busting. I was catching them, and then they stopped busting. So I was like, well, I can't imagine they just swam to the bottom. So I just started fan casting around, and I started catching more and more fish. Now, I can't say that that was a strategy I used all the time, but it was like one of the first eye-opening experiences to me that these fish were staying relatively near to the surface out in the middle of the lake over deep water. So you don't have to just fish the bottom if you're talking about fishing out over deep water. A lot of fish are suspended and really high up in the water column. The last one leads me to something that I feel like a lot of our so-called resources in the fishing world kind of lead us astray in a way. Meaning, one of the things that I feel like was just kind of repeatedly told to me over the years when I was, when I was growing up and even early on into my professional fishing career was to fish the shaded bank. And in reality, I don't agree with that at all. I've done videos on this, and it was like one of the first tournaments I fished in the professional level. Andy Morgan, who is like one of the best all-time fishermen in my opinion, probably the best shallow water fisherman ever. We were in the bag line and we were, we had seen each other on the water. We were talking, and at some point I made a comment about fishing the shaded side, and he's like, Matt, you want to fish the sun side, the sun exposed side, and look for the isolated pieces of structure creating shade lines. Meaning you're better off to fish the sun exposed bank where you may have one overhanging bush creating one little shade patch, because that's where the fish is going to be that's on that bank. They're going to retreat to those little shade spots versus having an entire shaded bank where they can roam up and down the bank like it's a low light period. So you're much better off fishing the sun exposed bank. It took me years and years for one of the legends of the sport to tell me that before the light bulb went off. And now it's like, you got to be kidding me. That makes so much sense. But yet I never grasped that topic or that idea. And it really, when you break it down by season, it even makes more sense. So if you're talking about cold water periods, so your spring, your fall, your winter, the sunlight is one of the things that the fish are going to be looking for as well, because those objects that they can move to on a sun exposed bank are going to absorb heat and therefore produce heat in the water, and that's what the fish are looking for in cold water. So they're naturally going to be by those objects, those few isolated objects. It could be dock posts, could be a lay down tree, could be a bush. Whatever it is, those objects absorbed heat and the fish want that. The summer, you go, well, the fish don't need the heat, but they're going to be looking for that little isolated shade patch to get out of the sunlight, because the shade patch will actually be slightly cooler, just like you and I go stand in the shade of a tree on a hot sunny day. It's no different for the fish. So in either case, regardless of season, the sun exposed bank is going to be better off for you to fish because it shrinks that shoreline down to a few isolated objects. Took one of the great ones in the sport to like hit me on the head to make that really sink in with me, because for years, all the magazines I had read, all the TV shows I had watched, fish the shaded bank. Well, I'm here to tell you guys, I don't agree with that at all. So that was 5 things for you. Those are 5 simple tips that I think you can take to improve your fishing success, learn from my mistakes, improve, the speed at which you go from, I just want to help you become a better angler. That's really what this comes down to. So I hope these were helpful. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comment section. If you did, I'll do more of these. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And stay tuned. We'll have a new one coming out tomorrow.